February 21, 1994, Arlington, Virginia, 6 in the morning. A man walks out of his house toward his car, a Jaguar. Elegant, expensive, incongruous with the salary of a federal employee. He doesn't get far. Dozens of FBI agents emerge from the darkness. Weapons drawn, bulletproof vests. The operation has been weeks in the planning and executes in seconds. The man doesn't run. He doesn't shout. He makes no gesture of resistance. He stops at the entrance of his own home and looks at them with a calm that is, in that moment, more disturbing than any resistance could be. His name is Aldrich Ames. He is 52 years old. He's chief of Soviet counterintelligence at the CIA, and for the last 9 years, he has been the most destructive spy in the history of the United States. The agency designed to hunt traitors has just arrested the man whose job it was to hunt them. How is it possible that no one saw it coming? To understand what Ames did, you first have to understand the world in which he did it. It was 1985. The Cold War was at one of its most volatile moments. Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire and had multiplied the intelligence budget as never before in the history of the country. The CIA operated with dozens of agents embedded inside the Soviet apparatus, men and women who risked their lives every day to send information from Moscow, from Leningrad, from the corridors of the Kremlin. These agents were not mercenaries. They were people who had made the most dangerous decision of their lives for different reasons. Some believed in Western values. Others had been disillusioned by the Soviet system. Others simply wanted to protect their families from a regime that devoured its own without mercy. Every single one of them knew exactly what the price of failure was. In that context, the CIA was more than an organization. It was the central institution of the most dangerous confrontation in human history, and its Soviet division, the heart of that entire machinery, was considered impenetrable from within. The CIA is not just an organization. It is a hermetic universe built on a fundamental premise: the systematic distrust of all its own members. Every employee undergoes regular polygraph testing. Every communication is monitored. Every trip abroad is recorded. Every contact with foreign nationals is documented and evaluated by multiple analysts. The counterintelligence department exists precisely to hunt traitors from the inside. They have psychologists specialized in lie detection, behavioral analysts who study patterns for years, financial anomaly experts trained to notice when someone spends more than they earn. The central principle is brutal in its clarity. The greatest danger does not come from the outside. It comes from within. No one should be able to operate as a double agent inside the CIA 4 months without being detected. Ames did it for 9 years. He had been born in 1941 in River Falls, Wisconsin, son of a university professor who had also briefly worked for the agency. He grew up in a quiet, middle-class family. No signs, no indicators, nothing that suggested what would come decades later. He joined the CIA in '62, at 21 years old, and he was young, had a father with connections at the agency, and an academic record solid enough to pass the selection process, the beginning of a career that would stretch across 30 years. During the following decades, he was exactly what his superiors described in his evaluations: competent but unremarkable. He was not brilliant. He was not visibly ambitious. He drank too much at office events, to the point that some colleagues remembered him as the man who always needed someone to drive him home and to department dinners. He had debts accumulated from his first marriage. He was disorganized. He arrived late frequently. He was, in every sense, the kind of man no one pays much attention to. That was exactly what made him invisible. And invisibility, inside an intelligence system, is the most powerful tool that exists. Security systems are designed to detect anomalies, behaviors that deviate from the norm. A man who was always mediocre, who always had debts, who always drank a little too much, triggers no alarm when he continues being exactly that. For more than 2 decades, he built a quiet career in the Soviet division, the most sensitive department in the entire agency. He knew the names, he knew the methods, he knew every thread of the network the CIA had woven with years of work and blood inside Soviet territory. In 1981, Ames was posted to Mexico City as a case officer. His official mission was to recruit Soviet sources, to identify diplomats or officials from the communist bloc who might be persuaded to work for the United States. There he met Rosario Cosas Dupuy. She was Colombian, from a wealthy family, educated in Europe, with a natural elegance that was magnetic. Ames fell in love with the intensity of men who arrive late to the emotions that change their lives. For him, accustomed to years of grey marriage and office routines, Rosario represented something he had never had, the feeling of actually living. The problem was money. The divorce from his first wife left him without reserves. Rosario had tastes that a federal salary could not sustain: expensive restaurants, travel, clothes, a way of moving through the world that presupposed resources Ames simply did not have. The debts grew, the pressure grew, and something inside Ames began to calculate options that no man in his position should ever calculate. In 1983, he returned to Langley, this time with a new position: Chief of Soviet Counterintelligence. He was, literally, the man charged with identifying Soviet spies inside the CIA. He had access to practically everything: classified files with the real names of active agents, protected identities, covert communication methods, complete lists of assets in Soviet territory with their histories, their vulnerabilities, their contacts. No one in the history of the Cold War had ever had so much access and so little money in their pocket at the same time. It was the perfect combination for a catastrophe. February 21, 1994, Arlington, Virginia, 6 in the morning. A man walks out of his house toward his car, a Jaguar. Elegant, expensive, incongruous with the salary of a federal employee. He doesn't get far. Dozens of FBI agents emerge from the darkness. Weapons drawn, bulletproof vests. The operation has been weeks in the planning and executes in seconds. The man doesn't run. He doesn't shout. He makes no gesture of resistance. He stops at the entrance of his own home and looks at them with a calm that is, in that moment, more disturbing than any resistance could be. His name is Aldrich Ames. He is 52 years old. He's chief of Soviet counterintelligence at the CIA, and for the last 9 years, he has been the most destructive spy in the history of the United States. The agency designed to hunt traitors has just arrested the man whose job it was to hunt them. How is it possible that no one saw it coming? The first was Valery Martinov, a KGB officer working in Washington who had been recruited by the FBI years earlier. He was called back to Moscow in November 1985. He never came back from anywhere. He was arrested upon arrival, tried in secret in less than 48 hours, and executed by a shot to the back of the neck in 1987. The second was Sergei Motorin, also a KGB officer in Washington, also recruited by the FBI. Same fate, same method, same silence. Oleg Gordievsky, one of British intelligence's most valuable assets, managed to escape thanks to an emergency exfiltration plan that British intelligence had prepared, but his identity had been compromised. The CIA lost years of accumulated work in that single operation. Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet general who had worked for the CIA for more than 20 years, was arrested and executed. He was the longest-serving asset in the history of the agency. Ames handed him over without hesitation. In total, at least 10 people died directly as a consequence of the information Ames sold. 10 real names, 10 families who waited for news that never came, who constructed explanations for an absence they could not comprehend, who lived 4 years in the uncertainty of not knowing whether their father, their husband, Their son had died or had simply disappeared into some corner of the Soviet system. Inside the CIA, alarm grew with a slowness that is difficult to explain today. The networks in the Soviet Union were being systematically destroyed, but no one could identify a definitive cause. A technical failure in the communications systems, a Soviet disinformation operation designed to sow confusion, a mole inside the agency. While the CIA searched for answers, Ames bought a $500,000 house in Arlington, Virginia. He paid cash without blinking. He bought the Jaguar. He completely renovated the home of Rosario's mother in Colombia. He paid off years of accumulated debt in a matter of months. A federal official on a civil servant's salary was living like a millionaire. And 4 years, incredibly, no one asked anything. Not because there were no signs, there were, but because no one wanted to look in the right direction. There was a moment in 1986 when Ames almost got caught for entirely different reasons. During a routine security review, an analyst noticed that Ames's spending appeared incompatible with his salary level. He presented the finding to his superiors. The institutional response was reassuring and devastatingly wrong. Ames had inherited money from a relative in Colombia. His new wife's family had resources. It was the most comfortable explanation, and it was the explanation that was accepted without further verification. No one called Colombia. No one verified the inheritance. No one traced the bank deposits back to their origin. The CIA did not want to have a mole, and when an institution does not want to find something, it develops an extraordinary capacity for not finding it even when it is directly in front of its eyes. By the late 1980s, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Too many assets had disappeared. Too many operations compromised in too little time to explain it all as coincidence or bad luck. The CIA launched a formal internal investigation in 1986, coordinated between the Soviet division and the counterintelligence department. Then another investigation in 1991, when the results of the first produced no clear suspect. Ames was interviewed in both investigations. He participated in the analysis meetings where the question of how the leak could have occurred was discussed. He suggested lines of investigation. He dismissed others. He passed the polygraphs. The results showed irregularities on both occasions, abnormal physiological reactions to specific questions about loyalty, and unauthorized contacts. The irregularities were classified as inconclusive. The polygraph operator attributed them to work stress and general anxiety. The investigators were looking in every direction except the right one. Why? Because formally accusing the chief of Soviet counterintelligence of being a Soviet spy was the hypothesis the institution could least afford to contemplate. It meant admitting that the system had failed at its most sensitive point, in the exact place where it was supposed to be strongest, that the Guardian was the thief, that the man charged with hunting moles was the mole. Organizations do not survive that kind of truth without collapsing first, and the CIA was not prepared to collapse. Ames lived inside that institutional paranoia with a calm that, in retrospect, seems almost supernatural. He kept working. He kept handing over information. He kept getting paid. He kept arriving late to the office and drinking too much at department dinners, perfectly faithful to the image of himself he had built over 30 years. But at some point in 1992, two women at Langley began to see what no one else wanted to see. Sandy Grimes had spent decades in the Soviet division. She was not a desk analyst. She had built personal relationships with many of the agents who had disappeared. She knew them by their real names, not just their code names. She knew that one of them had two young children. She knew that another had spent years patiently and painstakingly learning English so he could communicate better with his American contacts. She knew the small details that turn a file into a person. For Grimes, every name on the casualty list was not a lost asset in operational terms. It was a person who had trusted the CIA and had been handed over to their executioners. That difference matters, and that difference was what kept her looking when others had decided to stop looking. Together with her colleague Jean Vertifule, a Soviet division veteran with decades of experience in network analysis, she spent months building a correlation matrix. She was not looking for dramatic evidence. She was not expecting to find an envelope of cash or a spy camera. She was looking for patterns, dates of meetings with Soviet contacts cross-referenced with dates of bank deposits in the accounts of all employees with access to the compromised assets. The work was slow, meticulous, with no guaranteed result. 4 weeks the list of potential suspects included dozens of names until the mathematics began to speak. The transfers into Ames's accounts arrived with a regularity that could not be coincidence. Days after each documented meeting with Soviet or Russian contacts, money appeared. The pattern repeated with a precision that reduced the statistical probability of it being accidental to something approaching zero. The mathematics was perfect, and the mathematics pointed to a single man. It was not enough proof for a court, but it was enough for the FBI. The surveillance began in total secrecy in the autumn of 1993. FBI counterterrorism agents followed Ames without his knowledge for weeks. They installed microphones in his house while he was at the office. They placed cameras in strategic positions around his car. They tapped his phone lines, and they began to go through his trash, a routine operation in counterintelligence cases that produced immediate results. In the trash they found handwritten notes, fragments of communications, drafts of messages that Ames had considered destroying completely and had not destroyed carefully enough. The material confirmed active contact with Russian intelligence, no longer Soviet because the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, but Ames's relationship with the SVR, the KGB's successor, had continued without interruption. There was one night in December 1993 that the FBI agents working the case would remember for the rest of their careers. Ames left his house at 8 in the evening with no apparent destination. The surveillance team followed him through the streets of Washington in the darkness. And then, in a moment no one could fully explain, they lost him. The Jaguar disappeared into the nighttime traffic, and the surveillance teams lost contact. For 3 hours, the FBI operations room was silent. 3 hours in which everyone thought the same thing without saying it out loud. That Ames had detected the surveillance. That at that moment, he was passing information about his own investigation to his Russian contacts. That the entire operation, months of work, had been compromised. That the next day Ames would show up at the office as always, perfectly calm, and there would be no way to prove anything. 3 hours of silence on the radios. Ames had gone to the movies. When he reappeared 2 hours later at a movie theater in the Georgetown neighborhood, the agents who reacquired him had to control their breathing to avoid giving themselves away. That night, in the operations room, someone asked in a low voice what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to put into words. If Ames suspected he was being followed and yet continued with his completely normal routine, did it mean he had an exit plan the FBI didn't know about? An emergency protocol agreed with the Russians that would activate before they could touch him. The answer came 2 months later, on the morning of February 21, 1994, when he walked toward his Jaguar and the agents emerged from the darkness. He had no exit plan. He simply believed, after 9 years without consequences, that he was untouchable, that he had survived to investigations, to polygraphs, 3 decades of the control system without anything catching up to him, that he was invisible because he had always been invisible. It was the same mistake the CIA had made with him, the same human tendency to not see what one does not want to see. Ames pleaded guilty in April 1994. He avoided trial in exchange for cooperating partially with the authorities and for guaranteeing that the sentence of Rosario, who had active knowledge of all his operations and had managed part of the money received, would be reduced. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Rosario received 63 months in prison. She was released in 1999. The Soviets, the Russians, the agents who died because of his betrayal did not come back. No one negotiated for them. No one reduced their sentence. The case transformed forever. The internal security protocols of the CIA, mandatory and periodic financial controls were introduced for all employees with access to classified information, cross-referencing declared income with real spending patterns. Polygraph procedures were reformed to eliminate excessive discretion in interpreting results. New compartmentalization systems were created that drastically limited the amount of information any individual could access simultaneously, regardless of their authorization level. But reforms are always responses to the last war. Maps drawn after the territory has already been conquered. Aldrich Ames is still alive. He continues serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He's 83 years old. Sandy Grimes retired years later, having closed the case no one else wanted to close. In a subsequent interview, when asked what she had felt on the day of the arrest, she answered something they did not expect. Not relief, sadness. For those who could no longer see that moment, for Valery Martinov and his children, for Dmitry Polyakov and his 20 years of loyalty handed over to a man who sold him without hesitation. The question the Ames case leaves without a definitive answer is not how he did it. That was documented in thousands of pages of court records, in books, in documentaries, in testimonies that leave no room for doubt. The question is why it took so long. A man without extraordinary abilities, without special training as a double agent, without any ideology that justified his betrayal even to himself, motivated solely by personal debts and the desire to maintain a lifestyle his salary could not support. That man operated for 9 years at the heart of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world, because the system had a flaw that no polygraph can detect and no institutional reform can fully eliminate: the human tendency to not see the threat in someone too ordinary to seem dangerous. The system was looking for brilliant enemies. It was looking for committed ideologues, trained operatives, spies with exceptional abilities. And while it was looking for that, a mediocre man with debts and a Jaguar destroyed decades of work from the desk next door. The greatest dangers don't always have the face of an enemy. Sometimes they have the face of the colleague who has been greeting you in the hallway for decades and whose name you never quite remember. The man no one pays attention to. The man who was always too ordinary to raise suspicion. Sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who seems not to matter. Aldrich Ames serves his sentence in Terre Haute, Indiana. The men who died for his ambition would have grandchildren today. Their names remain classified in the archives of an agency that has still not found a way to explain, without shame, how it let them die.